Welcome back to Athens Happens. I'm Izzy Keller, managing editor of The New Political. Athens Happens is a podcast brought to you by The New Political, a student publication dedicated to explaining the nuances of Ohio University, Athens, and state politics. You can find new episodes at thenewpolitical.com or wherever else podcasts can be downloaded. In our first episode of the school year, I have the honor and privilege of speaking with Corinne Colbert and Dani Kington, co-founders of the Athens County Independent. The Indy is an independent nonprofit news source that launched this past summer. So how are you guys doing?
Doing well.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us.
We really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you both here. We really admire the work that you both do with the Indy and, of course, with making news more accessible and more independent. So we're really glad to have you on and to be able to speak with you. So I know you guys had your first launch, your second launch today. How is that going so far?
Pretty well. I haven't looked at the metrics. I've been kind of buried in other stuff today.
I have looked at the metrics multiple times, and it's been going great. Yeah, I think there's a real hunger for local independent news, and that is reflected in the response that we've gotten to both issues of our newsletter and the number of subscribers that we were very quickly able to get for this. And we're very pleased with how it's going.
That's awesome. So my first question is, can you tell me a little bit about the Indy? Why did you start it? What do you hope to, what kinds of things do you hope to cover, things like that?
Well, it all started at the end of February. When I got fired, I was the editor of the Athens News, and there was a dispute over advertising that wound up with me being fired. And the conditions there were also just not really great. So I left, and there was a mass exodus of staff, including Dani. And we very quickly realized that there was an opportunity to come out of all of this, to create an independent local news source that is focused on Athens County and that cares about Athens County. And that got traction really fast, and 6 months later, here we are.
Yeah, I guess, Corinne basically said it all, but, I worked at the Athens Messenger at the time when Corinne was editor of the Athens News, and, I've lived in Athens County for about 8 years and really have so much love for this community, and it was such a privilege to be able to cover this community while working at the Messenger. But I think for as much as I gained from that experience, it was also really eye-opening to me about the way local news media has declined over the years. There's been a palpable change since I first came to Athens, and actually working in the newsroom, it was very clear why. Just the number of empty desks was staggering, and there was no real resources or training, very young staff for the most part, and I don't say any of that. I would love to see the News and Messenger covering our communities well, and thriving, but in the absence of that reality, we saw a real need to restore robust local news coverage, and so that's what we've been attempting to do. Our long-term goals with the Athens County Independent include having regular coverage of all public bodies, local governments, school boards, and so on, as well as more investigative reporting, which is more how we've kind of started off, as well as, community-based reporting, covering things that are fun, that make people smile, which is an area we'd like to move more into. So,
if you go back to copies of the Athens Messenger from the late 70s, early 80s, before the Bush family sold it, that newspaper was packed with information, and it was a little bit of everything. There was solid news coverage of what was going on in county governments, but there was also, here's what this club is doing. Here's what's happening in this community. And when I was looking at that, it really broke my heart to see that, because, of course, what's behind all of that is a full newsroom. Journalism, as you know, is very labor intensive, and it takes people to do that. And what has happened is that, and it's not just here, this is happening all across the country, where newspapers are being downsized to increase profit for newspaper owners. Newspaper ownership is heavily consolidated in a handful of companies. There's not that local ownership that has the best interests of the community at heart when making decisions about coverage, but also about how many people you have in the newsroom. And when we were at APG, Adams Publishing Group, which owns the News and the Messenger, there were 2 full-time people for the Messenger and 2 full-time people for the News. Now there's 2.5.
Across both
newspapers,
outlets,
yeah. When I worked for the Marietta Times back in the late 80s, I was one of like 9 reporters, plus a full editing desk with a copy editor and a features editor and a news editor, and separate photographers and the graphics people. And we were doing all of that ourselves. If people are concerned about what has happened to their news, it's not because journalism is dead or journalists aren't good at their jobs anymore. It's because journalists are being asked to do the impossible. You can't cover a whole county with 4 people or 2.5 people. It's just not possible. And we want to reverse that with the Independent, with Southeast Ohio Independent News, by creating a robust newsroom that has the people who can go out there and get the news and deliver it to the county, to the readers.
And do you think that independent news like the Indy is the solution to this I don't know if dissipating is the right word, but the kind of disappearing newsrooms in small town communities?
Absolutely. Independent nonprofit news and also independent local for-profit news is the trend. So while corporate-owned newspapers are downsizing, continuing to shrink, being closed, being merged, there is explosive growth in independent news, both in the nonprofit side where we are and also on the for-profit side. There are 2 organizations. We are members of the Institute for Nonprofit News, which has over 400 members in the United States, and local independent online news publishers, Lion Publishers, which covers the folks who are for-profit. And they also have hundreds and hundreds of members. So that people are taking their news back. Very often those are founded like the Athens County Independent was, by reporters and editors, journalists who got downsized or didn't like the direction that their company was going in and said, we can do something better.
It is remarkable how many stories there are that are very similar to ours. I feel like when everything was happening at the News and the Messenger, when, the mass exodus of journalists, people were just sending me stories regularly of this newsroom got started the exact same way, which is both inspiring and very unfortunate. But yeah, to what Corinne was saying about the Institute for Nonprofit News, the largest area of growth among their membership is in local news media. So, we are definitely part of a trend. And Corinne also referred to Southeast Ohio Independent News, although we are, currently launching the Athens County Independent. Our long-term goal is to set this up in such a way that we can support the creation of independent, nonprofit local news across the region.
And let me ask you about Southeast Ohio generally, and even more broadly, like Appalachia. There's, do you think that access to reputable news sources is an ongoing issue in Southeast Ohio?
I don't think the problem is reputable. I can talk. Again, it goes back to that de-staffing I don't knock the people at the News or the Messenger because they are being asked to do the impossible. There's only so much you can do. And we've seen this in all kinds of industries where people are let go, there are layoffs, and you're expected to produce the same amount of work with fewer people. So the issue is not reputable news as so much as it is robust news.
Existing news.
Existing
Yes.
news, yes. You need enough people to be able to cover the school board and the township trustees and the county commissioners and the city councils and the school boards, along with, like Dani said, the fun stuff, the county fair, the Albany Fair, Brew Week.
And then the more investigative things too. It has been really incredible to be able to focus on that kind of in-depth reporting so far across our first 2 issues of the Indy. But, when we were at the News and the Messenger, we had such a laundry list of things we wanted to really dig into that we just did not have the capacity to do. So, I would very wholeheartedly agree with Corinne that, the issue in our local news across Southeast Ohio and Appalachia more broadly is not that stories are being published that are not reputable necessarily. It's just that the coverage that exists is far too sparse. There's been far too much consolidation for people to be able to gain much meaningful information from their local news.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's an issue that we talk about like all the time, whether it's in like the New Political or whether it's in our classes, is how, you have these big companies who come into town and they try to run news like a business, and it's not like a normal business, because the truth is most people aren't in it to make a profit, especially when we're talking about reporters and editors and photographers. They're there because it's a calling and it's something that they feel like it's important. So I do think that what happened with APG and then, even like the development of the Indy is like very, it mirrors a bigger issue in Ohio, and across the country. So for sure.
We just saw that recently. Gannett, which is the largest newspaper owner in the country, which owns the Columbus Dispatch, they own the Cincinnati Enquirer, they own the Chillicothe Gazette, I think they own the Marietta Times. They own a lot of newspapers in Ohio. They just let hundreds and hundreds of journalists go. What we say is, journalism isn't broken. The business model is broken. One of the reasons that we decided to become a nonprofit is that we very strongly believe that journalism is a public service. It's a public good, like having roads and running water and schools. It's something that the community needs in order to flourish. And we know through research that when there is the loss or the erosion of robust local news, you have fewer people running for office, you have greater government corruption, higher government spending, fewer people turning out to vote, higher rates of partisanship. It's indicative of an erosion of community values. And, in Appalachia, where community is everything. I grew up in Eastern Ohio, and I've lived here in Athens County for decades. Community matters here, and people want that news. And so with a nonprofit, what we can do is all the money we make comes back into supporting the mission. It's not going to enrich Dani or I. It's not going to an owner somewhere on the other side of the country to buy and fly a private jet. It's all going back to doing what we set out to do, and that is delivering high-quality local news.
I think a big part of our mission, too, is to invest in the resources we have within our community already. So, we're committed to trying to create a work environment for journalists and, adequate pay and benefits for all of our employees such that we don't have the very high rates of turnover that are characteristic of most local news media, and so that we can have people from here who are able to stay here and do the jobs they're called to do for the communities they care about and love. So that's a big part of it too.
And we want to develop a network of correspondents who are covering their own communities. So, getting somebody who lives in Amesville or in Ames Township who covers the Ames Township trustees and Amesville Village Council and just things going on there. Because they're the ones who know their communities best. They're the ones who already have that trust. And we want to give them that opportunity to share information on a wider scale than they can, at Parks Place or on Facebook or Twitter.
Yeah, for sure. And, what would you like to see in the future for the Indy? Like, what do you hope? Do you hope it to be like an online news source? Do you hope it to be like a printed news source? Like, I'm just very curious what the future holds.
The number one question we get asked is, are you going to be in print? We would love to be in print. There is a strong affinity for the printed word. And particularly in a region like Southeast Ohio, which does not have great broadband, the problem is that newsprint is horrendously expensive. I mean, in a newspaper, newsprint is probably the biggest expense behind salaries. And depending on the staffing level, they may be spending more money on newsprint than they do on salaries. We just don't have, we need to get to that place where we have the newsroom operating sustainably and then add a print product to that.
Yeah, and I think, our vision of what we would hope to achieve, what does a sustainable newsroom look like? I think it would have, reporters dedicated to, community and culture, as well as government and schools, education, and then the correspondence network that Corinne talked about, so that there aren't, Athens County is home to multiple news sources, which is not true of some of our neighboring counties. However, some communities within our county are not covered by those news sources. They're essentially news deserts. They might not appear on the map as such because, there might be a newspaper covering stuff 15 miles down the road, but if people have no access to news about their community, we're not satisfied. Yeah.
We want to make sure that people are able to read about Albany and Shade and Coolville and Doneville and Millfield, Gloucester, Jacksonville, Trimble. All of those communities deserve to be covered. They're every bit as important as Athens and Nelsonville, which get the lion's share of the coverage because they are the big metropolises for Athens County. And that erosion has really hurt the news business.
We sent our assistant news editor to, Nan Whaley was at Brennan's, and we sent him there, and he heard about, Trumbull and, all these different places, and he was just, really taken aback by, how little he knew about those different types of communities. So you're absolutely right. And I think that even, I'm speaking from a student journalist perspective and working for a student publication, we don't get around to covering those communities, unfortunately. And I think that that's something, that the New Political and, other publications need to look more into. So I'm glad that, you mentioned, Trumbull and Coolville and all of those communities as well. What makes the Indy different from other news sources around Athens, including the newspapers and the student publications and so on and so forth?
Well, in addition to, what we've already described and sort of the premise, our business model is fundamentally different. We rely on direct community support rather than advertising. And so, of course, we'd encourage donations, and we'd encourage people to be on the lookout for a membership program that we will be unveiling to foster that kind of community support in the coming months. But I would also say, a big part of our mission and our values is about giving voice to those marginalized from power, which we think goes hand in hand with the mission of, restoring journalism to communities, whole communities who've been marginalized from the conversation. So not just putting news into the hands of people who haven't had it, but making the news about those people, about the people whose names don't normally appear in the newspaper. One thing that is a consequence, I think, of the understaffing of local newsrooms is that, if you're on a production timeline and you have to get a story in for the edition tomorrow, you're going to talk to the people who are easiest to talk to. That's just the reality of it. The people who, due to positions of power that they hold or their privilege, are able to be readily available to speak with you. So I think we want to fundamentally shift what that looks like, and really make an effort to include in the conversation not just the people who might be considered as the ones making the news, like elected officials, but the people who are affected by the news and do have the power to make the news as well, but are too often not considered as having it.
One thing that has always kind of bothered me is that there are communities that only get covered, get any kind of attention during observances. So Black History Month, everybody makes an effort to have a Black History Month story. Or Pride Month, everybody makes an effort to have an LGBTQ story. But that gives readers the impression that those members of our community are, okay, well, we've given them what they need for this year, and now we're going to go on and back to our usual programming. It's important for a newspaper to reflect its community, and our community includes people of diverse backgrounds, diverse views, diverse activities. And those people shouldn't just be consulted when there's some observance. Those voices should be reflected in the news every day to help people remember that, we have people of color in this community. We have LGBTQ people in this community. We have poor people in this community. And making sure that those voices are represented in everyday coverage and not just something that's observational.
We definitely, for sure. So how can our listeners, check out what you guys are doing or join your newsletter subscribing list?
So you can go to athensindependent.com, and there are buttons right at the top that say donate and subscribe. Something that we need people to understand is that we are a nonprofit, which doesn't mean that we don't make a profit. It just means that how we use our income is different. We are a mission-driven organization, and so we want to offer advertising. We plan to offer advertising, but the majority of our support is going to come from the community directly, either as gifts or memberships or sponsorships. And that's where that support has to come from in order for us to be sustainable. That's where we spend a lot of our energy and time when we're not reporting the news, is how do we reach people? How do we make it sustainable? So please go to athensindependent.com, click on donate, click on subscribe. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
And Instagram.
We just went on Instagram. But also, if you're a subscriber, please share your copy of The Independent, the Indie, which is our email newsletter. Share that with your friends and your family and your colleagues, and encourage them to subscribe. Tell them why you value local news. The other thing, Dani mentioned that we're going to be unrolling a membership program shortly. Later this fall, through the Institute for Nonprofit News, we are participating in their News Match program, which will offer a dollar-for-dollar match of gifts between November 1st and December 31st. It's a really powerful way for people to increase the impact of their giving. So we'll be having more details about that in future issues of the Indy, and we just want to let people know that that's coming, and to keep us in mind on Giving Tuesday and all the other times when they're thinking about giving money to a cause.
So long story short would be subscribe, share and give.
Subscribe, share, and give, absolutely.
Okay. And how often do you release newsletters?
Newsletter comes out monthly right now. We are working toward posting news more regularly. We're also working on getting our news site set up. We have a website, but it's not a news site build just yet. So we're hoping to start producing news regularly at that address in 2023.
Awesome.
But yeah, monthly in the meantime. And as we kind of scale up and lay the groundwork for more regular coverage, you'll see that reflected in the newsletter. So this month we had twice as many stories as last month. We're not going to double it every time, but we do hope to be growing to the point that it does make sense to do it more regularly.
Awesome. All right. Do you have anything else that either of you'd like to add?
Just thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Yeah, we really
appreciate
appreciate your interest. We've been so bowled over and amazed, and we're so grateful for the response that we have had from the community so far. It's made all of this hard work worthwhile, and it's what keeps us going.
I thank you both. It's really an honor to have you both here and to talk to you, because you two are doing great work in the community. So, thanks for just coming by and speaking with me.
Thanks for the invitation. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Athens Happens. Make sure to check out thenewpolitical.com for more podcast episodes and other content. Thank you, and until next time.